I'll marry you if you can fly this plane, black cleaner's shocking response to Millionaire's mockery. I'll marry you if you can fly this plane. The entire cabin burst into laughter as the arrogant millionaire mocked the young woman scrubbing the floors near his seat. To him, she was nothing but a cleaner, invisible, unworthy of respect. His friends joined in, their laughter echoing off the polished walls of the luxurious private jet. But no one there expected what would happen next. No one expected her shocking response. It all began on a warm summer morning at a small but busy private airport. The golden rays of sunlight bounced off the wings of planes lined neatly across the runway. Mechanics hustled, ground staff moved luggage, and wealthy passengers strolled around, sipping coffee, waiting for their flights. Among them was Sophia, a hard-working woman in her late 20s, pushing her cleaning cart toward one of the sleekest jets on the runway. Sophia wore her faded blue uniform and simple sneakers, her dark hair tied back in a neat bun. To strangers, she looked like any other cleaner, someone blending into the background, barely noticed. But behind her quiet eyes lay years of struggle, sacrifice, and a dream that once burned bright. Sophia's life had never been easy. She had lost both her parents when she was just a teenager, leaving her with the heavy responsibility of raising her younger brother, Daniel. Every job she took, every long hour she worked, was for him. She wanted to give him a future better than hers. Yet, before tragedy struck, Sophia had been on a very different path. As a student, she was brilliant, especially when it came to aviation. Flying fascinated her. While other children played with dolls or toys, Sophia would watch planes cutting through the sky, her heart racing with excitement. Her dream was crystal clear: she wanted to become a pilot. And for a time, it seemed possible. She studied hard, earned a scholarship, and even enrolled in aviation school. Her instructors praised her skill and focus, often telling her she had the makings of one of the best pilots they had seen. The sky was her home, the cockpit her kingdom. She belonged there. But life is not always kind to dreamers. When her parents passed away suddenly, Sophia was forced to drop out. She could no longer afford tuition, and her younger brother needed care, food, and stability. The dream of flying had to be folded away like a paper plane. To survive, she worked whatever jobs came her way, cleaning offices, waiting tables, and eventually, cleaning airplanes. Ironically, she found herself close to the very world she had once belonged to. Day after day, she scrubbed cabins, polished windows, and wiped down leather seats, all while suppressing the ache in her heart. Each time she stepped into a cockpit to dust the panels, her fingers itched to touch the controls, to flip the switches, to feel the power of flight again. But she reminded herself that those days were gone. Now she was just the cleaner. On that fateful morning, Sophia was assigned to clean the private jet of Richard, a wealthy businessman with a reputation for arrogance. He was the type of man who believed money placed him above everyone else. People around him laughed at his jokes, even when they weren't funny, just to stay on his good side. As Sophia bent over, scrubbing the spotless floor of the jet, Richard and his friends entered, carrying glasses of champagne, their expensive suits gleaming. They lounged in the plush seats, chatting loudly about deals, vacations, and women. Richard's eyes landed on Sophia. He smirked, whispering something to his friends. Their laughter grew louder. Then, with his voice raised enough for everyone to hear, he called out, "Hey, cleaner girl. You look bored. How about this? If you can fly this plane, I'll marry you." The cabin erupted in laughter. The wealthy men slapped their knees, choking on their drinks at what they thought was the funniest joke of the day. To them, it was impossible. A woman in a janitor's uniform flying a multi-million-dollar jet? Absurd. Sophia froze, her heart pounding. The sting of humiliation burned deep. She had endured insults before, people ignoring her, talking down to her, treating her like she was invisible. But something about this moment felt different. This wasn't just a joke, it was an attack on her dignity, her worth. Slowly, she placed her cloth back into the bucket and stood up. She turned toward Richard, her eyes locking onto his with a steady, fearless gaze. "Is that a promise?" she asked quietly, but firmly. The laughter died instantly. The room grew still. No one expected her to respond, let alone challenge him. Richard raised an eyebrow, amused. "Of course," he said smugly. "If you can fly this jet, I'll put a ring on your finger right now." His friends chuckled again, but with less confidence this time. Sophia didn't smile. She didn't back down. Instead, she walked toward the cockpit. The men gasped, whispering among themselves. "What is she doing?" one of them muttered. Richard leaned back in his seat, smirking, waiting to watch her fail miserably. But as Sophia sat in the pilot's seat, her hands moved with practiced familiarity. Her fingers danced across the switches, her eyes scanned the instruments, and her posture shifted from that of a cleaner to that of a professional pilot. The cabin fell silent, all laughter evaporating into disbelief. No one could have guessed that the woman they mocked, the one they thought had no worth beyond scrubbing floors, carried a secret skill powerful enough to shock them all. And in that moment, Sophia was no longer just a cleaner, she was the woman who was about to change everything. That morning, as Sophia carefully polished the leather seats of a Millionaire's private jet, the hum of engines outside blended with the clatter of her cleaning supplies. She worked with quiet focus, her movements graceful despite the routine nature of her job. To her, every corner of the jet deserved attention, not because she loved cleaning, but because she believed in doing her work with dignity. Little did she know that within minutes, her life would change forever. The cabin door suddenly swung open with a burst of energy. Richard, the jet's wealthy owner, stepped inside with three of his closest friends. Richard was a man whose very presence screamed power. He wore an expensive tailored suit that seemed to shine under the cabin lights, and his wrist gleamed with a diamond-studded watch. Everything about him was loud, from his booming voice to his arrogant laughter. He was the kind of man who believed money gave him the right to look down on anyone beneath his social circle. His friends weren't much different. They laughed a little too hard at his jokes, nodded eagerly at his stories, and seemed to compete for his approval. Together, the group carried an air of superiority that filled the cabin. Their voices bounced off the polished walls as they joked carelessly about deals, vacations, and the people they considered less fortunate. Then Richard's eyes landed on Sophia. She was bent over, polishing the seat with deliberate care, her simple blue uniform starkly different from their luxury suits. He smirked, nudging the man beside him, and whispered something that made his friends chuckle under their breath. Loud enough for everyone to hear, Richard called out, "Hey, cleaner girl." Sophia paused. She straightened slowly, turning her head toward him. Her face was calm, but inside her chest, her heart thudded a little faster. She was used to being overlooked, ignored like a shadow. But when people did notice her, it was usually to make a comment that reminded her of her place. Still, she stayed silent, waiting. Richard tilted his head, grinning as if he was about to perform for an audience. "You look like you could use some excitement," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Then he raised his hand toward the cockpit. "How about this? If you can fly this plane, I'll marry you." The cabin exploded with laughter. His friends roared, slapping their knees and spilling drops of champagne as they howled. To them, it was the funniest thing they had heard all morning. A cleaner flying a multi-million-dollar jet? The very idea seemed ridiculous. But to Sophia, the words weren't a joke. They were a sting, sharp and humiliating. Her face flushed, not with embarrassment but with anger. Over the years, she had endured endless slights. Customers ignoring her greetings, people dismissing her as if she didn't exist, strangers assuming her worth could be measured by the mop she carried. She had always swallowed the pain, keeping her head down, telling herself it didn't matter. But this time, something was different. The laughter surrounding her wasn't just mocking her job, it was mocking her dreams, her intelligence, her very identity. Something inside her snapped. She set the cleaning cloth carefully back into her bucket, her movements deliberate and calm. Then she stood tall, squaring her shoulders, and turned to face Richard directly. Her eyes locked onto his with a fire that made the air in the cabin feel suddenly heavier. "Is that a promise?" she asked, her voice steady, cutting through the laughter like a blade. The men froze. The sound of their amusement faded into silence. None of them had expected her to answer back. They had expected her to laugh awkwardly, to blush, to look away in shame, or to pretend she hadn't heard at all. But this quiet, fearless response unsettled them. Richard blinked in surprise, then leaned back into his seat, his grin widening. He thrived on attention, and this only fueled his ego. He raised his glass of champagne and chuckled. "Of course," he said, savoring each word. "If you can fly this jet, I'll put a ring on your finger right now." His friends erupted into laughter again, though this time it wasn't as confident as before. Their eyes darted between Richard and Sophia, unsure of where this strange turn was heading. Some of their laughter sounded forced, like they were trying to convince themselves the situation was still funny. But Sophia wasn't laughing. Her face remained calm, but her heart thundered in her chest. The weight of years pressed down on her, years of sacrifice, years of dreams buried beneath duty. She thought of the countless times she had stepped into cockpits while cleaning, her fingers brushing lightly over the controls she knew so well, remembering the lessons from aviation school. She thought of her instructors who once told her she was born to fly. And now, here she was, being mocked by a man who knew nothing of her past, nothing of the fire she carried inside. Sophia inhaled slowly, gathering her resolve. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, not of amusement, but of determination. Without a word, she began walking toward the cockpit. The men's laughter faltered. "Wait, what is she doing?" one of them whispered, his voice uneasy. Richard leaned back, smirk still plastered on his face, clearly expecting a show that would end in humiliation for her. But as Sophia's figure disappeared into the cockpit, something shifted in the atmosphere. The mockery had awakened something in her, a part of herself she thought was lost forever. And none of them were ready for what she was about to do. Moments later, Sophia walked straight toward the cockpit, her footsteps steady, each one echoing louder than the last. Gasps filled the cabin as the men exchanged nervous glances. "What is she doing?" one of them whispered, his voice laced with disbelief. Richard leaned back, smirk still plastered on his face, clearly expecting a show that would end in humiliation for her. But as Sophia's figure disappeared into the cockpit, something shifted in the atmosphere. The mockery had awakened something in her, a part of herself she thought was lost forever. And none of them were ready for what she was about to do. Moments later, Sophia walked straight toward the cockpit, her footsteps steady, each one echoing louder than the last. Gasps filled the cabin as the men exchanged nervous glances. "What is she doing?" one of them whispered, his voice laced with disbelief. Richard, however, only smirked, swirling the champagne in his glass as though he were watching a comedy show. "Relax," he said smugly. "She's just trying to impress us. She won't even know how to turn it on." His friends chuckled weakly, but their laughter lacked the same confidence as before. There was something unsettling about the way Sophia carried herself, as though she knew exactly what she was about to do. When she entered the cockpit and sat down in the pilot's seat, everything changed. The woman who had just been scrubbing floors moments earlier was gone. Her posture straightened, her hands moved with practiced certainty, and her eyes, oh, her eyes, gleamed with a fierce determination. They were no longer the weary eyes of a cleaner. They were the eyes of a trained aviator who had spent years studying, memorizing, and dreaming of the skies. Her fingers moved swiftly across the control panels, flipping switches, adjusting knobs, and scanning instruments. Each motion was smooth and deliberate, the kind of precision that comes only with training and experience. To the men watching from the cabin, it was as though she had transformed before their very eyes. The room went silent. Not a single laugh echoed now. Richard's smirk faltered, confusion flickering across his face as the sound of the aircraft systems powering up filled the cabin. One by one, the lights on the panels illuminated, and the soft whir of machinery came alive under her touch. Then, the engines roared. The powerful sound rattled through the jet, vibrating in the seats, silencing the last shred of doubt. Richard's glass slipped slightly in his hand as he stared, his mouth hanging open. His friends clutched their armrests, wide-eyed and pale. None of them could comprehend what was happening. The cleaner they had mocked, the woman they had reduced to a joke, was bringing their multimillion-dollar jet to life with flawless precision. Sophia's face remained calm, though inside her chest her heart raced, not with fear, but with exhilaration. She had missed this feeling, the hum of the engines beneath her, the smell of fuel, the weight of the controls in her hands. This was her world. She belonged here. With her foot steady on the rudder pedals, she eased the jet onto the runway. The nose pointed forward, the vast stretch of asphalt lying ahead like a promise she had been waiting to claim. She exhaled deeply, her hands tightening on the controls, and then, with a smooth push of the throttle, the jet surged forward. The acceleration pressed the men back into their seats. The engines roared louder, a deep thunder that drowned out every thought. Richard's smirk was gone now, replaced by shock as he realized this was no act. The jet sped faster, the runway blurring beneath them. Then, with the gentlest pull on the yoke, Sophia lifted the nose of the aircraft. And just like that, they were airborne. The jet sliced through the air, rising higher and higher until the ground shrank away beneath them. The city became a patchwork of tiny shapes, the cars below reduced to moving dots. Within minutes, they pierced through the clouds, the sky opening wide, endless and blue. Inside the cabin, silence reigned. No one dared speak. The only sound was the steady hum of the engines and the faint crackle of the radio in the cockpit. Richard's jaw hung slack, his champagne forgotten on the table beside him. His friends clung to their seats, eyes darting nervously as if the world had flipped upside down. The irony was too heavy to ignore. They had mocked her, laughed at her, treated her as though she were invisible. And now, their lives were literally in her hands. The nobody cleaner had become their pilot, soaring through the clouds with skill that none of them could deny. Sophia felt a surge of triumph course through her veins. It wasn't about proving them wrong, it was about proving herself right. She hadn't lost her gift. She hadn't lost her dream. It had only been buried under the weight of responsibility and struggle. But here, above the clouds, it came alive again. Her hands guided the jet with flawless precision as she banked slightly, giving the men in the cabin a breathtaking view of the endless horizon. The sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating their stunned faces. Some of them looked terrified. Others looked awestruck. But all of them knew the truth, this woman was no ordinary cleaner. After a wide, graceful circle above the city, Sophia leveled the plane, her every movement steady and controlled. For her, this was second nature. For them, it was a revelation. Richard finally found his voice, though it came out in a whisper. This isn't possible. But it was. And Sophia was living proof. She allowed herself a small smile as she glanced at the horizon. For the first time in years, she wasn't trapped on the ground looking up at the sky. She was where she belonged, in control, unstoppable, and free. Back in the cabin, Richard and his friends sat in stunned silence, their arrogance stripped away at 30,000 feet. None of them could laugh now. They could only watch, powerless, as the cleaner they had mocked soared higher than they had ever imagined. And Sophia? She knew this was only the beginning. Sophia's heart pounded, but not from fear. No, this was something else entirely. For the first time in years, she felt alive. The steady vibration of the engines beneath her feet, the weight of the yoke in her hands, the endless sky stretching before her, it all felt like coming home. She was no longer just a woman in a janitor's uniform. She was a pilot again. She was where she belonged. Her eyes glistened as memories flooded back. She could almost hear the voice of her old instructor reminding her to trust the plane, trust yourself. She remembered the late-night study sessions, poring over flight manuals until her eyes burned. She remembered her first solo flight, the rush of adrenaline and joy as the wheels lifted off the ground. And she remembered the heartbreak of leaving it all behind when life demanded sacrifice. But as she guided the jet gracefully through the air, she realized something important: she hadn't lost her gift. It had only been sleeping, waiting patiently for the right moment to awaken. And now, in front of the very people who had mocked her, belittled her, reduced her to just a cleaner, she was proving her worth, not with words, but with action. The men in the cabin sat frozen in silence, gripping the armrests of their leather seats. Every tilt of the plane, every smooth maneuver Sophia made, chipped away at their arrogance. The same mouths that had roared with laughter minutes ago were now sealed shut in awe and fear. Richard, their leader, sat pale-faced, his once confident smirk erased, his jaw slack. Sophia allowed herself one final circle above the glittering city. The skyline sparkled beneath the morning sun, the streets winding like ribbons far below. Then, with calm precision, she began her descent. Her hands moved with certainty as she adjusted the flaps, lowered the landing gear, and aligned the aircraft with the runway. The men held their breath, expecting disaster at any moment. But Sophia knew better. She had trained for this. She was ready. The runway rushed up to meet them. With a steady hand, she eased back on the controls, and the wheels kissed the ground with elegance. The plane glided smoothly, the engines humming as they slowed. Within seconds, the jet rolled to a perfect stop, as gentle as a bird settling onto its nest. Silence. Not the mocking kind, not the dismissive kind, but a silence thick with disbelief and awe. Sophia switched off the engines, her hands calm, her breathing steady. She sat for a moment, savoring the feeling, the taste of victory that wasn't about humiliating them, but about reclaiming herself. Then she stood, her figure tall and proud, and walked back into the cabin. All eyes turned to her. The same men who had laughed at her just minutes earlier now stared at her as though they had seen a ghost. Their arrogance had evaporated, leaving only shock and shame in its place. Richard was the most shaken of them all. His face had lost its color. His hands, once so confident holding a glass of champagne, now trembled slightly as he struggled to process what had just happened. He opened his mouth once, twice, but no words came out. The mighty millionaire, the man who thought himself untouchable, was utterly speechless. Sophia paused, letting the silence stretch. The weight of it pressed on Richard and his friends, each second magnifying their humiliation. Finally, with a calm smile tugging at her lips, she broke the silence. "So, when's the wedding?" The words hung in the air like thunder. Richard's eyes widened. His friends glanced at one another nervously, unsure whether to laugh or stay quiet. No one dared make a sound. Sophia's tone hadn't been mocking, but calm and steady, almost playful. Yet the irony cut deeper than any insult could. She had taken his careless words, his cruel joke, and turned them into a weapon sharper than a blade. Richard stammered, his voice trembling. I was just joking," he muttered, his confidence shattered. "You know, it was all in fun." But his excuses sounded weak, pitiful even. Everyone in that cabin knew the truth. He had been humbled, utterly, completely, by the very woman he thought was beneath him. Sophia didn't need his ring. She didn't want his wealth or his name. She had already won. Her dignity, her confidence, her dream, they were all hers again. She had faced mockery and turned it into triumph. She had taken back her identity in the most powerful way possible. As she picked up her cleaning bucket and headed toward the door, the crew burst into quiet applause. Mechanics, flight attendants, and even the co-pilot who had been watching from outside stepped closer, their eyes wide with admiration. News of what she had just done spread quickly, whispered from one worker to another like wildfire. One of the senior pilots stepped forward, his eyes shining with respect. "You don't belong with a mop in your hand," he said softly. "You belong in the sky. If you're willing, I can help you get back there." Sophia paused, her heart swelling. For so long, she had believed her dream was gone forever. But now, opportunities she thought had slipped away were opening once again, because she had dared to stand up for herself. Behind her, Richard sat slumped in his chair, humiliated and defeated. The story of his arrogance and Sophia's triumph would spread far beyond this cabin. Among his wealthy peers, the tale would become legend, how a millionaire was silenced by the cleaner who turned out to be a hidden pilot. Sophia stepped outside into the sunlight, her chin lifted high, the runway stretching before her like an open road. She didn't need Richard's promise. She didn't need his validation. She had something far greater, the sky. And for the first time in years, she believed, truly believed, that her wings were still waiting for her. The cabin erupted, not with laughter this time, but with applause. The sound echoed off the sleek walls of the jet as crew members, who had been silently watching the drama unfold, clapped in awe and admiration. Their faces beamed with respect for the woman who had just silenced arrogance with skill. Richard's face, however, told a different story. His once confident grin had evaporated, replaced by a pale, shaken expression. He stammered, trying to form words, but none came out the way he intended. I was just joking," he muttered, forcing a weak laugh that fooled no one. "Come on, it was all in good fun." But the words fell flat. His excuses sounded hollow, desperate, and pitiful. The bet he had made to entertain his friends, the careless words he had thrown out with arrogance, had backfired spectacularly. He had expected laughter and mockery, a show at someone else's expense. Instead, he was the one humiliated, and not just in front of his closest friends, but in front of his crew, his staff, and soon, the world. Sophia stood tall, her calm smile unwavering. She didn't need to rub his defeat in his face. The truth was already clear, etched into the memory of every person present. The millionaire who thought money made him untouchable had been humbled by the woman he mocked, the woman he believed invisible. And the most powerful part? Sophia didn't care about marrying him. She didn't need his ring. She didn't need his wealth. She didn't even need his approval. The moment her hands touched the controls of that jet, she had already won. What she had regained was worth more than all of Richard's riches combined, her dignity, her confidence, and her dream. That very day, as she stepped off the jet and began walking back toward the hangars, one of the senior pilots hurried after her. He had watched the entire scene unfold, his eyes wide with disbelief and admiration. "You were incredible," he said breathlessly. "The way you handled that aircraft, it was flawless. You don't belong on the ground cleaning planes. You belong in the sky, flying them." Sophia blinked, her heart swelling with emotions she hadn't felt in years. "I used to be a student pilot," she admitted softly, her voice carrying the weight of memories. "But life got in the way." The pilot shook his head. "Life hasn't ended yet," he said firmly. "We have a scholarship program starting soon. With what I've just seen, I'll personally recommend you. You have a gift that shouldn't go to waste." For a moment, Sophia stood still, letting his words sink in. Opportunities she thought had been buried forever were suddenly alive again, shimmering with possibility. All because she had dared to stand up for herself. Word of her bold display spread quickly through the airport. By the afternoon, mechanics, attendants, and even other pilots were whispering about the cleaner who wasn't just a cleaner at all, but a hidden pilot with extraordinary talent. Some looked at her with newfound respect, others with admiration. For once, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't background noise. She was someone who demanded to be seen. Richard, on the other hand, never lived down the embarrassment. Among his peers, the story became a favorite, repeated at parties, retold in boardrooms, whispered in golf clubs. The tale of how a millionaire, full of pride and ego, was silenced by the very woman he mocked became a lesson in humility. His friends would never let him forget it. The man who thought himself untouchable was reduced to the punchline of his own cruel joke. And Sophia? That single moment changed everything for her. She was no longer just a cleaner scrubbing the floors of planes she longed to fly. She was no longer the woman who quietly accepted being overlooked. She was the woman who had taken mockery and turned it into triumph. She was the woman who showed courage when others expected shame. Her story didn't end in that jet, it began there. Because from that day forward, doors opened. Training programs welcomed her. Mentors supported her. The dream she thought she had lost was placed back into her hands, stronger than ever. But perhaps the greatest victory wasn't the applause, the opportunities, or the recognition. The greatest victory was what she reclaimed within herself. She had proven, not just to them but to herself, that her worth had never been defined by a uniform, a job title, or someone else's opinion. Her worth was defined by her skill, her courage, her resilience, and her refusal to bow to arrogance. So, the next time someone underestimates you, remember Sophia's story. Remember that people may laugh, they may mock, they may dismiss you as unworthy. But sometimes, the ones the world laughs at are the very ones who can soar the highest. Because true strength isn't about wealth, or titles, or appearances. True strength is the ability to rise when others expect you to fall. And when you finally spread your wings, even those who doubted you will have no choice but to watch you fly.